Welcome to Living Well with MS. This show comes to you from Overcoming MS, the world's leading multiple sclerosis healthy lifestyle charity, which helps people live a full and healthy life through the Overcoming MS program. We interview a range of experts and people with multiple sclerosis. Please remember, all opinions expressed are their own. Receive monthly tips and ideas about living well with MS by signing up for our newsletter at overcomingms.org/newsletter. And now, let's meet our guest.
Welcome to the latest edition of the Living Well with MS podcast. And today I'm glad to welcome back Jack McNulty, our resident chef. So, welcome back, Jack.
Thanks, Jeff. It's good to see you again. It's been a while since we've done one of these, so I'm really looking forward to another chat about some interesting food topics.
And today's food topic is fermentation. So, firstly, could you tell us what it is and how it might fit in with the Overcoming MS diet?
Yeah, we're choosing sort of a light topic. There's not really much to fermentation. It's only been going on for centuries and centuries. So basically, the idea of fermentation is just it's a natural process of using bacteria and yeast to sort of break down sugars and starches in vegetables or the food that helps preserve that food. But it has some other aspects of it which makes it very interesting from a culinary perspective. So it's going to change flavor profile, and it increases and offers some nutritional benefit, which is obviously something of interest to those of us that are following the OMS diet. And I think nutritionally, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too much. There's a lot of information on the OMS website, I'm assuming, as well as just doing some internet searches in terms of the probiotics, antioxidants, all of those sorts of wonderful benefits that come from eating or consuming fermented foods and drinks. From my perspective as a cook, there's just so much interesting aspects to what fermented foods can bring. And, people always like, oh, it's so boring to eat a plant-based diet and all those foods are, they just taste really bland and whatnot. And that's true, but as you evolve in that sort of sphere or world, you start to realize there's so many interesting things that you can do to sort of pump up the food a little bit, and using fermented foods is one way to do it. I mean, it's going to give you a lot more of that savoriness, that umami that we all sort of crave, that fifth sort of taste that's been around for a while. It's going to change texture. It's going to add acid, which is really important for fatty or carbohydrate-rich foods to provide a little bit of balance. It's going to offer a lot in terms of doing regional type foods. So for instance, if you want to make something Japanese or Moroccan or any of those sorts of things, it just adds that little element that perhaps a lot of people miss. And it just sort of closes the book on that particular recipe that makes it really enticing.
And so if you're coming to this from someone who's completely new, mm-hmm. What do you need? What's the most straightforward way to begin with fermentation? I know we're going to discuss this. There's loads of different. I think a lot of people actually don't realise they're consuming fermented foods already.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is store bought. But if you're making your own, what equipment and what's the most straightforward way to start?
It's a good question. I think it's really important. First of all, to understand that it's an art as well as a technique. So doing something fermented leaves a lot of open space. It's like a canvas, an open canvas for an artist. You can do a lot and create a lot when you start going down that path of fermentation. So if you're just starting out, personally, I would recommend starting out with something very simple, and it's easy to find simple recipes on the website or any website or just by doing some simple research. Sauerkraut or kimchi, things like this are just so simple to do. Sauerkraut basically is just going to be chopping up cabbage, giving it a little massage with your hands, adding a bit of to release the water, and then adding a bit of salt to that and keeping it submerged, and then just letting nature do the rest for, waiting 1 to 2 weeks or so and keeping an eye on the process. That's really all that's involved. It couldn't be much more simple than that. Kimchi is in essence really the same thing. You're going to add some other flavor elements, and the process only takes 1 to 3 days or something of this nature. It's really a quicker way to do kind of a fermented food. Doing something like I'll pop these up because I like having preserved lemons in my life, and that's a batch that I continue to have going currently. And I started those like in July or something. I use preserved lemons in everything. It doesn't have to be Moroccan, but it gives you that little special bit of flavor burst. And so to get started with something like that, it's really, you need a glass jar, you need some kind of, or fermentation crock, a ceramic crock or something like that. You need something that's going to create a weight to keep the vegetables submerged. That's really important because it needs to be in an anaerobic environment without oxygen reaching the food. If it does reach the food, then you're going to have problems with mold development and things like that, which will ruin everything. A lot of times you're going to need something after it's done to create that airlock or to seal it. Using non-reactive tools, really simple, wood or silicone works fine, and often like a scale or a thermometer. And from there, it's really just getting started and choosing something really, really simple to start off the process, because it's sort of like going to school and kind of like doing those first little scientific experiments. Let's see what happens when we, cut up some lemons, put some salt in it, and then watch it sort of ferment. Watch the process happen over a few days, turning cloudy, and then, starting to see bubbles sort of react, and then managing the whole process over a period of anywhere from a week to a month at just room temperature, and seeing how everything changes. Checking it every day, checking the smell, taking a little taste of the liquid that's in there, and really having fun with it brings a lot of excitement to the food you're making. It's of course it's going to take a while, and patience are key, but it can't be more simple, but also more entertaining. I think it's just really that way. That's the way to get started, in my opinion.
And if it went wrong,
yeah.
Because we're talking about like food that we're not eating for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks.
Exactly. You're intentionally using bacteria.
Yes.
So you do have to be a little bit careful, and certainly that's always going to be a concern. And it's something you need to keep an eye on while the process is going on. So if it does tend to go bad, your nose will be your biggest judge as to whether that's off or not. And generally, if it smells bad, really bad, you don't consume it, you throw it away. Mm-hmm. And if mold starts to develop on the top, you just know, okay, that batch went wrong, and you throw it away. And everybody that starts off in fermentation is going to have eventually a batch that's going to go off. That's just part of what happens in the fermentation game. And when it does, you'll know really fast, that didn't work. Because it's not going to be sour. It's going to have something that's, it's quite frankly going to smell of death. And so you don't necessarily really want to put something like that in your mouth.
So for me, I think the key was what you said about the keeping it underwater.
Yeah.
So I make I make a few different things, but if I'm making sauerkraut, then I have a reasonably large bowl, and then I put a plate that's smaller than the diameter of the bowl. Firstly, so it's got the water, then I put cling film over it, then I put the plate on it, and then I have a kilner jar that ultimately it will be stored in.
Yeah.
But temporarily I just fill that with water, and then it just pushes the plate down. And as long as everything's underwater, then I've never had a sort of mold problem.
That's right, and that's one of the most basic key elements in lacto fermentation is keep everything submerged. And when I do it, so I'll just use this jar again as an example. I have something like this big like this, and I had this recommended to me one time, and it was really a cool idea. You see it in recipes, get a weight to weigh it down, and a rock or something like this is what you often see in recipes. But I came across an idea one time that stuck with me. This was years ago, and I've used it ever since. So I just take like a normal Ziploc freezer bag, and I just pop it over the top of the jar and then just fill it with water. And the water acts as the weight and keeps everything submerged, and it fills in all of the gaps. So it couldn't be any easier to use a weight than something like that. And then it's really simple to just change that or take it off and then refill it and keep everything submerged. I think that was probably the biggest game changer for me, because I was always struggling with, now what kind of weight am I going to fit into this opening here that's going to keep everything down? And then invariably something would come up on the sides, of whatever you're using. And yeah, it was always a bit of a hassle. But the water works great. It really spreads out and keeps everything nicely submerged.
And a lot of people will be familiar with fermented foods from a dairy point of view. So I think probably one of the most popular has to be yogurt.
Yeah.
But equally, kefir is traditionally made with milk. So can you make these OMS friendly?
Oh, absolutely. So yogurt is basically going to be you can make it with any sort of plant-based milk. I find that the best ones are the ones that tend to be the highest in fat content, so soya works, I find, the best in terms of making a nice creamy yogurt. You see all the time that if you go out and shop that people are using coconut a lot. I don't really find that it's necessary to go down that route. Soya works perfectly fine. A nice thick oat milk will also work. And basically what you need is just some sort of plant-based yogurt starter. And those are pretty simple to find these days in any health food store or online. You can get something like that. And so the process, if you're making yogurt at home, if you want to do that, and a lot of people end up doing that about once or twice, and then they realize they can just go buy it really simply. But it is fun to make yourself. And basically you want to heat the plant-based milk up to a certain temperature. I think it's around 180 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 82 degrees centigrade. And then you cool it down to around 110 Fahrenheit or 43 centigrade. And once it's cool, then you add your starter to that. Mix it together, and then you have to incubate it. And that's where a lot of people have the issue, is keeping that constant temperature of between 38 and 40 degrees centigrade, something in that nature, for 6 to 12 hours. How do you do that? Some people wrap it in a warm towel, but mostly the best way to do it is you have some sort of yogurt incubator, which is, if you're going to make a lot of yogurt, that's a worthwhile investment. And that will keep that constant temperature. And then it's done. And, you take a little of that yogurt that you just made, use it to start the next batch, and enjoy what you just made.
So, I remember as a child, we used to do it with milk yogurt, and we had a yogurt maker.
Yeah.
And so it's really straightforward because it did all the so the temperature's the same as with
exactly. It's the same.
So you could still use exactly the same equipment.
Exactly, and that's why I think soya milk works the best, because soya milk, without any additives, and unsweetened soya milk is what I'm talking about here, is going to have almost the same characteristics as normal cow's milk. And so that's why it functions really well in the yogurt environment.
And you could buy a store-bought soya yogurt as your starter.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You can do that easily. You'd need a little bit more because those are going to be pasteurized. So it depends on how much of the living elements are still in that yogurt, but you can do that for sure. But you can also easily find yogurt starters anymore, plant-based yogurt starters.
But like you say, it will never be economic to do this because by the time
It's
you bought
more,
the equipment,
exactly. It's one of those things that's more fun than anything else. I know
Yeah.
we'll probably talk about sourdough bread in a bit, but it was that craze of sourdough that overtook everybody at the beginning of the, should I say, the COVID years.
Well, no, it was, wasn't
When
it? Everyone in
everybody was
COVID.
home, lockdown, everybody's like, oh, crazy, I have to make my own bread, so why not make sourdough? Great. And everybody did it. Then they realized, oh, you got to keep it alive. Nobody wanted to take care of it anymore. And then you had the next pandemic of dying sourdough cultures around the world. And everybody just realized you can just go buy it much easier.
And how about kefir? So kefir is normally a milk-based product.
Yeah. Do you make it? Do you make kefir? Or have you
We
ever tried it?
we do. So I do know the answer to my question actually, because there is also available as water kefir.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
So for those that aren't familiar, kefir is sort of an interesting process to make. So they call it kefir grains, but it's really not a grain at all. It's more of like a little gelatinous kind of bead, if you will. And it's basically just a symbiotic combination of yeast and bacteria, much the same that would be used in making kombucha, for instance. And they're just little beads that are going to feed off a sugar. So basically, you're going to sweeten the water that's going to feed off that, and then you drink it, basically. But it's not going to have the same sort of tangy, acidic note that like a kombucha would have.
yeah, I mean we have both in our house, so it is it's a different flavour. So I think people prefer one or the other.
Exactly, and they also have quite good health properties to it, and from a probiotic standpoint and that sort of stuff.
And I think with kefir and kombucha, I'd say that the flavour actually is coming from, you do like a second ferment, so you ferment it and then you can add fruit to it, which gives it the flavour. You have somewhat of a flavour. I mean, kombucha is sort of tea based, isn't it? I guess you could make kombucha with water. It would work, wouldn't it? But the flavour's coming from the things you add to it. So then you try out different things. We were talking earlier, like ginger and lemon works quite well. And
well, just out of curiosity, because this is a question that always comes up with someone that's just getting started on kefir or even kombuchas, because they multiply. So those little kefir grains will multiply with every time you make it, and then you're left with suddenly more than you could possibly use. So what do you use them for?
We don't use them for anything. We don't know of a good use of them. They go into the green waste.
Yeah,
and
you don't. I know a lot of people did this. I did this when I was making a lot of kombucha. There's a lot of local communities of makers of kombucha or kefir that share their multiplied grains, or in the case of kombucha, it's called a SCOBY, which is sort of a round disc-like thing. And
so I have given SCOBYs away to people.
Yeah.
My wife found a thing online that said you could make a snack from them by grilling them. Don't try it. I don't know where she found this. It was hideous. It was like eating leather. I mean, it's quite. If people haven't come across them, they're quite a they're sort of halfway between leather and rubbery, sort of like.
Yeah, the kombucha. So kombucha is basically what we're talking about. For those that don't know, is a kombucha is made with brewed green or black tea that's been sweetened, usually a little bit of older kombucha or even distilled white vinegar is added to it, and then what's called a SCOBY is added. So the SCOBY is what is it? Symbiotic something or another of well, it's basically the yeast and bacteria. I forget exactly what it stands for, but it's basically just it feels a little bit like plastic in a way, and it's a disc sort of shape. And with each round that you make of kombucha, a new layer develops. And so over time, it goes from about that thick to about that thick to about that thick, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And you can peel off the layers, which is sort of interesting. So that the process takes about, it depends on the temperature, but anywhere from 3 to 7 days until it becomes really sort of tangy and bubbly and whatnot. And kefir is basically going to be the same process, but the little beads are different than the SCOBY that's used for kombucha. So you're going to be still left with more kefir grains than when you started the process.
And the only thing I'd say, actually, from our experience of it, is that the second fermentation you normally do in a sealed bottle,
yes,
and then it gives it a bit of a fizz. You need to release the pressure at least every day.
Exactly, and be cautious of using a glass container in that, because it will create a lot of pressure.
I mean, we do use a glass. I mean, but glass containers will take, champagne is pretty highly pressured. So
true, but if you forget about it in the refrigerator,
yes,
you're going to have a mess to clean up.
Yeah, it's particularly when it's not in the refrigerator. It's just when that second ferment. But when we have forgotten, it's blasted the top off a water, glass jar. There, those sort of snap tops, and it came off so quickly that it shot into, hit the ceiling. So yeah, and it will go everywhere as well.
Exactly. I had an exploding bottle one time where I actually forgot about it. It wasn't with kombucha. I was making something like ginger beer or something like that, and forgot about it in the refrigerator until that explosion suddenly brought my attention to the refrigerator in a quick hurry, and there was a significant mess in there. Yeah, it was.
So onto that. So kombucha. So you probably need to know someone who's already got a SCOBY, or you can. I started it by buying a kit which came with the glass jar. Well, you actually start the jar initially with that is not sealed, so you're not worrying about that on its first ferment. Yeah. But it had all the stuff you needed. So you can buy kits, or you could, if you know someone who has kombucha, as you've said, they will have SCOBYs regularly.
Yeah, you can look online. There is a way to actually, and I'll include this in the show notes, but there is a way that you can start it yourself, the whole process. Same thing with water kefir. If you wanted to go down that path and just see what that process is like, there's a way to do that. It's a little bit more involved, but
I think try again as well. It took us to get the kefir going. It took us a few goes, and then once you've got a sort of happy little colony, then it will just keep going.
Yeah, true. And the same thing with kombucha. Once it gets going, then you're brewing every week. You're going to have a couple of liters of kombucha.
Yeah. And you mentioned sourdough. So sourdough, that's fermented, is it?
Yeah. So you mean as opposed
sourdough
to
bread? Yeah.
Yeah. So the main difference between like sourdough bread and commercial bread is going to be in the leavening agent. And so sourdough is typically made with what's called a sort of fermented culture of wild yeast and bacteria. So it's basically going to take the yeast that's all around us all the time, and you're creating a culture. And there's a process of making that culture, which we can discuss in a minute if you'd like. So you go through that. It takes usually around a week to get a sourdough starter going. And once you get it, that's sort of your wild yeast, which is a combination of wild yeast and the bacteria. And so you're using that to ferment the bread, to actually give the leavening in the bread. So the fermentation generally takes longer than using commercial yeast, something you would buy in a store. The flavor is going to be much different, so it's going to have a sort of that acidic quality, whereas commercial bread is just going to taste doughy. The texture is going to be different, so the crust usually on sourdough bread is going to be a little bit crustier, and the dough inside will be a little bit chewier. The shelf life will be much longer than traditional store-bought bread, and of course there's some benefit nutritionally, because of the process of the fermentation. It sort of breaks down some of the gluten a little bit. So it's going to be easier to digest for most people. Not necessarily for people that are going to be intolerant to gluten, but for some people that may be on the edge, sourdough would be definitely easier to digest than something commercially purchased. And it's a fascinating world. And I was just in Provence a few weeks ago, and we walked into this small town bakery, and this single baker was there, and he had the whole town. He had basically a monopoly, and he made his own ferment. So he only baked maybe about 6 or 7 different kinds of bread, and he had several different kinds of wild ferments in there, and he was so passionate about his whole process that when we walked in there and showed a little bit of interest, he just was, suddenly we had these buckets of wild yeast thrust in front of our face to go smell this and smell that, and just so pleased with and passionate about making the bread a specific way and having it taste a specific way. And it was incredible. It was just an incredible experience and a taste sensation, and it really did last. We bought probably more than we needed to, and so maybe it was already 10 days later we were still cutting into that bread that we had left over, and it was still fine. It hadn't gone really dry and hard like a lot of commercial bread would at that point. No, it was unbelievable.
I did. You mentioned COVID. Like we did it. We made sourdough at COVID, and it's just I think it's really great having freshly made nice bread.
Yeah.
But you are committing to doing it quite regularly, because I think you're basically adding flour, adding water, taking out starter, making bread. You're making bread every other day, probably at minimum. I'd say you probably need to kind of commit to.
You have to feed the starter. For those that don't know, I'll just run down the process. We can include this in the show notes also, but if you wanted to make your own starter, it's basically just taking about 50 grams of whole wheat flour, mixing it with 50 grams of water or 50 milliliter of water, and just putting it in a clean jar and mixing it. So, and then letting it stay. You put a cloth over the top of it. There's no need to seal it, and you just let it sit at room temperature for 24 hours. So the next day, you have to take half of that mixture and get rid of it. So discard it. You hear about sourdough discard all the time. So you're taking that, and then you take another 50 grams of flour. You can use all-purpose flour at this point, mixing it again with equal amount of water, and then mixing that into the remaining bit that you had going, and then you let that go 24 hours, and you repeat that process for about 5 to 7 days until you start to see it kind of rising up in the container, and then you can definitely smell the acidic quality to it. So then you're left with a sort of child that you have to take care of now, because they will die if you don't pay attention to them, and they need to be regularly fed. So you can discard all but about 50 grams of your starter, which means you use that bit to make a bread. That's your leavening for the bread. And you have 50 grams of your starter, and then you go to that process again of 50 grams flour, 50 grams water, and adding that back in, and then that's your feeding. And so that needs to be done on a regular basis. So you're right, you're either going to be baking bread regularly, like every day, or you're going to be discarding a lot of dough on a regular basis to keep it well fed. Now you can refrigerate it, in which case you only need to feed it about once a week instead of every day. As long as you bring it to room temperature, give it a good feeding, let it come up a little bit, and then pop it back in the refrigerator.
Ours did survive a 2-week holiday, actually.
Exactly. And you can do that. You can even freeze them. There's a way to do that if you're gone for an extended period of time, but it's challenging to bring that back to life, as you can imagine. It would be.
And the only other thing I would say that we did, the jar that we had it in, using a dry white marker to mark how high up it was, and then you can see it growing.
Exactly.
Like you're not just imagining it, you can see, all right, it was there, all right, it's gone up. And then we kind of knew, like, okay, that's the fifth, that's our sort of how much we take out level.
Yeah.
And that's where we want it to be when it's sort of...
And this is the fun part of food, isn't it? I mean, it's when you start experimenting a little bit like this and you start getting into it. I mean, I don't make my own sourdough bread every day. I'll do a starter and keep it going for a bit, but, I run out of patience just like everybody else. But it is really cool to get into that and start figuring things out and playing with different proportions and, adding a little rye flour in there to give it a little bit of a different flavor instead, and you can play around in that particular arena and just create different things. It's fantastic. It brings a lot of joy to food.
And also, when we started it, I had a tip. If you add some organic green grapes, just sliced in half, add that to I guess they have the yeast on the skin or something.
It kickstarts it. You can do it with actually any fruit. You can use like an apple or something like that and just pop it in at the beginning. It sort of kickstarts the yeast process, the yeast and bacteria. Just remember to take it out.
Yes. Okay, so some other techniques as well, which people might not be aware of fermentation. Pickling would be a big one. So how do we go about pickling? I mean, when we've got, it's a preservation technique, but it's also a fermentation technique. So how do we go about pickling vegetables?
The biggest difference between, a lot of people confuse the two. What's the difference between pickling and fermentation? So there is a major difference. Both of them are going to preserve the food, but then the nutritional aspect afterwards is much different. So fermentation, when we're talking about fermentation, in this particular case, we're talking about what's called lacto-fermentation. So it's basically going to be adding, submerging vegetables in a brine of salt water or salt in the juices from the vegetable. It's going to be in an anaerobic environment, and it's going to be allowed to have the bacteria ferment the vegetables. And that's what's going to create that sort of lactic acid. That's why it's called lacto-fermentation. Has nothing to do with lactose. It's just the terminology. That's going to preserve, it's going to create probiotics, different flavors, that sort of thing, unlock different flavors as well. Pickling is different in the sense that it's going to be primarily in an acid solution, so typically vinegar. So you're going to preserve the food in that. Generally, it's not going to be allowed to have any bacterial growth. So the bacteria is not allowed in pickling, whereas it is in fermentation. It's a faster process, but generally it needs to be heated as well. And then it produces that sort of sour, tangy kind of aspect. So you can do quick pickling as well. That's often done. I do it a lot with onions. So you slice onions, you add a little vinegar, you can add a sweetening agent to it. I like adding a little bit of chili into it as well, kind of in salt, and then massaging it all together and letting it sit for a half hour, and then you have basically a very fast pickled onion that you can use in a salad or however you want to use it.
But then that doesn't have the probiotic benefits of fermenting.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's going to have a nice flavor, and you can keep it a little bit longer, but it's not going to be nutritionally the same as doing something that's going to be fermented.
Okay.
And it has to do with the bacteria, and that's really the primary difference.
So there was one thing that was mentioned. We had Michael Grieger on an episode, which was, he was saying you've got to watch out for the salt content because, as you mentioned, things like sauerkraut, kimchi, they have salt used as part of that brine. So is that a concern?
Well, it would be a concern if you put in too much salt.
Right.
That's my view on that. I understand what he's saying, and I think that if you're eating, large quantities of sauerkraut or kimchi, or large quantities even of something like miso or using soy sauce a lot, you're going to want, there is a lot of sodium in there, and so that is going to be a concern. It might even be more of a concern with people that are on medication also. So that's a good reason to discuss that with a health professional. That's certainly nothing I'm going to be aware of, other than I would ask that question if I wanted to consume a lot of those products. For me, I think getting the salt right is the main thing. So if you're making sauerkraut, the process of making sauerkraut is really simple. So you're slicing up the cabbage, you're adding a little bit of salt, you're massaging it, releasing the water, and then you're letting it ferment. But the salt amount is what's critical, and recipes are there for a reason. So generally, you're only going to be using a very small amount. Something like a 1% or something like that, salt solution, 1 to 2%. It varies depending on what you're trying to do, is how much salt you're actually using. But you don't need a huge amount to allow that fermentation process to occur. So yeah, there's going to be salt in it. That sodium is not going to disappear during the fermentation process. And I will leave it sort of at that. For me, I have no qualms about eating sauerkraut during the cold season, once or twice a week or whatever, or kimchi and that sort of thing. I'm not that concerned about it. But for someone that's maybe interested in watching their sodium consumption for whatever reason, that would be something to look at. Yeah, and I would say.
But as part of a balanced diet when you're having lots of other food.
Yeah.
Okay. And so we've mentioned a little bit with you mentioned miso and so I'm guessing most people are not going to make their own miso or soy sauce, but something that came up was Koji. So what is Koji?
Well, that's another way to ferment. So Koji is basically a cultured mold. And so that mold is going to be applied to something like a grain, rice or barley typically, or soya. And the enzymes in that mold are going to break down the proteins and the fats. And that makes it basically a catalyst for fermentation. It speeds up the process and opens up different flavor combinations or different flavors that might be in that soybean, right? And so through that process of the enzymes mixing, it's going to release different things, and that's why you're going to have different flavors. So let's take miso, for instance. So miso is basically, you're going to have the koji mixed with cooked soybeans. I think they're cooked. And that process then is going to get mixed together, and that paste that's going to result is allowed to ferment for a very long period of time. It can be anywhere from a year to 30 years. Wow. I mean, they can let it go really a long time to change the complexity of the flavor. And some really old miso that's been produced in a certain particular way is going to be extremely dark, and it's going to have a flavor that's there's no other way to describe it other than it tastes very meaty. It tastes very much like eating a piece of meat, and when it's not at all. And that's what that sort of process is going to do. So koji, there's a lot of interesting things that you can do with koji. It's not the thing that you're going to necessarily, you can make it at home, but generally it's better to just find a source and purchase it. And so there are some interesting things you can do with it. You can make quick ferments, with vegetables overnight, in a grain or something, and you can basically ferment a carrot or a cucumber overnight in koji, and it will be a very interesting texture the next day and flavor. But you can make a particular kind of drink called amazaki. Just different things like this that you can do with koji. It's just a different way to begin the fermentation process.
And from those things, so those soy-based products and miso and soy sauce, and I'm guessing it's going to give it a sort of Japanese flavour. They sound like quite Oriental foods.
Exactly. And I think that's another benefit, of using these kinds of fermented foods, because, for instance, I use miso quite often. It's kind of the darling in cooking these days. You see it a lot on cooking shows and people doing miso glazed this or that. But miso is very useful in terms of, and there are, of course, different kinds of miso, but in terms of adding that sort of umami aspect to food. So, for instance, I make these Japanese sort of potatoes that are long cooked, boiled potatoes that have been sort of braised in this miso mix. And they're just sort of a really rich, golden, dark color that has a very fantastic flavor because of the miso that's in it. And I think that's the kind of thing that you can do to add a different element to just something so simple like boiled potatoes.
And so another one, because we've talked about some sort of vinegars and things like that, but something that's really popular at the moment is apple cider vinegar.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure that all of the health claims are accurate, because if you look on YouTube, then I think it would probably cure all illnesses. But certainly there are health benefits. So can you make that yourself? Could you make apple cider? Because a lot of these things, I do sort of wonder, like, you see shop bought things. A lot of them are going to be pasteurized and treated and heat treated and all these things just to give them shelf life. And then you sort of think, well, is it actually going to do what it's supposed to do? So, like kimchi, we quite often buy kimchi actually, but we get a refrigerated kimchi rather than a kimchi that's going to last for 6 months. Because I imagine that's not actually alive.
Commercial based kombucha is going to be mostly pasteurized. It's like, well, what is that actually doing to the benefit of drinking the kombucha in the first place? Mm-hmm. Then you're just basically drinking a pasteurized fizzy drink.
Right. So can you do it? Could you make your own apple cider vinegar?
You can. It's really simple to do. You can just get some apples, chop them into some pieces, put the pieces in a large container and cover it with water, basically. You're going to add sugar to get that fermentation process going. And then you're going to cover it with a cloth and basically let it sit for 2 to 3 weeks.
Okay.
Keep the bugs away. You stir it, fairly often. You strain out the apple pieces, and then you take that liquid and let it ferment an additional 2 to 3 weeks. And then that will create what's called the mother eventually, and that creates the acetic acid with the time, that fermentation process, and that's what's going to give it that sort of vinegar flavor. So it is really simple to do, and you can do that really with almost any fruit. You can make blackberry vinegar if you want, using kind of the same process. So it's just allowing those natural yeasts and bacteria to work on the sugar, which you're going to add to it, and allow that fermentation to occur. Strain it out and let the liquid continue to ferment for a period of time. You should give it a go.
Well, I was going to say, so there's 2 questions I had. Firstly, if people wanted to give it a go, and they've heard about all these things, you could make kimchi, kombucha, sauerkraut, vinegar. What's the easiest one to start with, do you think?
Well, sauerkraut's going to be the easiest. I mean, any of the kombucha will be also simple to start, although you'll need to get the SCOBY from somewhere. Mm-hmm. Kefir is the same thing. You just need to get the kefir grains to get it going. But if you wanted to do just a simple fermentation, certainly preserved lemons, which is just basically fermented lemons. It's just salt, lemons, and lemon juice. And then, you don't want to cover it with the lid like this for the first week or so. You want to just use a cloth and allow that fermentation to occur just with a cloth, because you want the outside yeasts and bacteria to come in. You don't want to close that out, but you got to make sure you keep everything submerged. Doing something with cucumbers and just making your own salt fermented pickles. It's something I do every year when we get them, like almost like the cornichon. You can do them with the small ones, and it's basically exactly the same process as making preserved lemons. It's just in a water and salt brine, and just allowing those cucumbers to sit in there and ferment at around 21 degrees centigrade, for about a week to 2 weeks, depending on the conditions of everything that's around. But it's really simple to do, and watch as you go, and then you'll be amazed at how they taste. And it's kind of a fun process to manage.
And one other one, is there a risk that you could end up making something alcoholic?
Well, certainly fermentation does create alcohol. Wine, for instance, is fermented grapes. And so that's eventually, those sugars are going to eventually turn to alcohol. And yes, alcohol will be in there. I'm not so sure. It's a good question, and I don't want to overstep what I'm going to say, because I'm not 100% sure how much alcohol, like, for instance, in sauerkraut, there's no alcohol that I can detect in sauerkraut. So, I would have to look into that a little bit. I'm sure some of the listeners out there probably have a better answer than I just did on that.
But I think it's very low, isn't it? If you made it apple cider vinegar, it would be.
Yeah, exactly. And same thing with kombucha and kefir. I mean, if there is alcohol that's still in there, it's probably not going to be a lot. I mean, so once the yeasts are consuming all of the sugars, that process of converting it into alcohol would probably stop anyway. And I'm pretty sure that in some of the lactofermentation, the salt is going to prevent that alcohol from forming, although I'm not 100% sure on that.
Okay, and just finally, so I think you've given people a good, hopefully you've inspired some people to get started, but and some good tips. But is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners about fermented foods?
Fermentation is an art and a science. It's an opportunity to experiment and to explore different things that you can do with food. And the idea is to just have a little bit of fun with it, and hopefully be comfortable enough to say, I'm producing something that's really good for me, and this is actually going to benefit me. It's going to benefit my microbiome. It's going to benefit my life by doing this. And so and it's fun. And I think it's a process that can be just really enjoyable, especially if there are kids in the household, because anything with, playing with food and what's going on with food, kids are just kind of like drawn to it like a magnet. They get really interested in that sort of thing. It's like a science experiment at home. But just be cautious of keeping things, submerged, keeping an eye out for mold development, those sorts of things. And, it's better to err on the side of safety. And if you're not 100% convinced that something is going to be safe to eat, then just don't eat it. Just start over.
Okay. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us again, Jack McNulty.
Yeah, it was great talking with you, Jeff, and catching up. And again, we'll put all of this out on the show notes. I know in my newsletter, for those that don't know, I write a newsletter called Vegan Weekly that I publish on Substack. And I will be writing a lot about fermentation in the coming weeks, so that's a good place to turn also if you need some additional ideas and tips.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Living Well with MS. Please check out this episode's show notes at overcomingms.org/podcast. You'll find useful links and bonus information there. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and please rate and review the show to help others find us. This show is made possible by the Overcoming MS community. Our theme music is by Claire and Mab Dean. Our host is Jeff Alex. Our videos are edited by Lorna Greenwood, and I'm the producer, Regina Beach. Have questions or ideas to share? Email us at podcast@overcomingms.org. We'd love to hear from you. The Living Well with MS podcast is for private, non-commercial use and exists to educate and inspire our community of listeners. We do not offer medical advice. For medical advice, please contact your doctor or other licensed healthcare professional.